trapped in the fog, but no one believed me. They called it weather at first, a stubborn bank of fog that rolled over the cliffs and pressed itself into our streets like a damp, indifferent animal. I watched from my window while the town woke and shrugged. People poured their coffee, walked dogs, complained about their trains. Only I felt the wrongness as a shape under the mist, a small insistence at the edge of sight. It arrived with the sound of a distant bell and the smell of wet paper, and it left behind a quiet like someone had taken one of the notes from a melody and hoped nobody would notice. At noon, I met Mrs. Hale on the corner, bent over a grocery bag as if it anchored her to the world. I told her about the way the fog made the lamplight pool at our feet, and the way a shadow had turned its head as if listening. She smiled that small, rehearsed smile and said everything was fine. The fog was pretty today. She liked how it hid the telephone wires. Her hands trembled when she handed me a lemon, and when I asked about her dog, she blinked and said her dog was perfectly fine. Although, she added, she couldn't remember the dog's name. By evening, the town seemed to forget small certainties. I heard neighbors say they had taken a different route home and meant to call each other later about it, as if the map of the town had rearranged without their permission. I took notes, because notes are the one thing that feels like proof. I pressed a brass key into my palm and let its cold weight remind me that something tangible existed. My phone held photos, but the images were a smear of salt and light. One photo showed my own face, turned away, the eyes only a suggestion. I tried to tell the police about the disappearances, even if the thing that vanished was only a day, a name, a memory. They were polite, reluctant to give the word, unusual, more weight than it deserved. A young officer chalked it up to nostalgia, or old men talking up storms, and suggested I sleep on it. That night, I walked the streets with the key in my pocket and the watch in my coat. The watch stopped forever at 3 o'clock, but sometimes, when the fog leaned close, I heard a soft, impossible tick from its casing, as if it were remembering how to beat. I began to map what the fog claimed. Small things first, a bench by the pier with a fresh initial carved into it, the name of a bakery that reopened and then closed without reason, a row of tulips that became sand. People lost appointments and then couldn't find the day they had been scheduled for. When I tried to compare notes with others, their timelines slid like wet ink. They remembered different weather, different music on the radio, different jokes told at market. Their faces were sympathetic, but their voices carried no fear, only a patient, baffled ignorance that felt like a mild, contagious amnesia. I started taking pictures of small certainties. The clock on the bakery, a painting in the library, the tag on Mrs. Hale's cardigan. Each photo was a small talisman against losing even the shape of things. Later, the photos themselves betrayed me. They showed the same places, but with alterations. The clock hands moved. The painting's subject had a different gaze. Mrs. Hale's cardigan pattern shifted. One photograph contained an extra doorway where none had been. I could imagine stepping through it like a person who finds a secret room and then wonders if the key will stay with them. grew tired of asking, tired of offering evidence that bent around the town's collective denial. Friends called to ask if I had been sleeping well and if I had eaten. I felt like a man insisting the wallpaper had been replaced, while neighbors measured wallpaper samples with indifferent hands and told me how lovely the new pattern was. One evening, a child in the square pointed at me and asked a question I could not answer. If the fog could make people forget, could it also make them forgive? The child's face had no memory of asking, and no one else seemed to remember the moment at all. One night, I found a brass key on my pillow. I knew I had not put it there. It was not the same key I carried. It bore a tiny, unfamiliar engraving that looked like a map fold. My hands remembered handling it, though my mind refused the memory. I followed the map in the heady gray hours, feeling like a trespasser in a town that was already half loaned to the fog. The map led me to an alley I had always thought of as a cut-through. Tonight it was different. The bricks rearranged into a tiny arch I had never noticed, warm with old smoke and possibility. Inside that arch the air was less wet and more like a kept room. Paper stacked in crooked towers, a lamp with no bulb, and a door that gave the impression it might open if you only let go of what you thought you knew. I pressed the key to the lock and felt as if I were choosing which pieces of the town could remain whole. I turned it, and the door did not creak so much as sigh. Somewhere a tide shifted. On the other side was the same street, rearranged, like a model rebuilt after midnight. My voice, echoed and soft, said a name I had forgotten. After that night, people smiled at me with new patience, as if I had finally accepted what could not be fixed. My maps sat on the table, their lines beginning to curl at the edges, the ink running into the damp like veins. Sometimes I would wake and find a photograph turned face down, a detail erased from the surface by some invisible thumb. Sometimes Mrs. Hale would tell me a story about a youth she had never lived, and then apologize for confusing days. And sometimes, in the small hours when the fog sits and thinks, I hear the watch ticking, and the sound is not mine at all. People stopped believing that a thing outside them could rearrange life. Our town prefers logical grief and tidy answers. The fog offered none. I became a private archive of oddities, a jar of changed labels, a copy of a book that told a different ending each time I opened it, a string of dates that refused to line up. I sometimes thought the fog was a test, or a living absence that wanted to be noticed. If it wanted stories, I tried to give it ones that hurt less. If it wanted names, I held my tongue and let my memory be a small, private thing. The climax was not a scream or revelation so much as a quiet arrangement. Mrs. Hale came to my door one morning with a cup in each hand, asking if I would like some tea. Her memory had folded in on itself into a new shape. She called the lighthouse by another name, and when I corrected her, she kissed my forehead like a niece might. She handed me a photograph and said softly that the town had always been this way, soft edges and borrowed faces. I looked at the photograph and saw my own hand there, closing a small brass door, the key slipping. Then the image bled into fog. Now, years later, if years remain an accurate count, the town is quieter in a way that suits the fog. People keep their days in jars. I still carry a key, though which one I cannot say. And sometimes the pocket watch ticks at impossibilities. When a new mist comes up from the sea, children laugh and call it pretty, and adults pretend they remember what the town used to be like before the weather claimed it. I walk the streets and leave little notes under stones, small anchors of language that say this happened, this person existed, this worry was mine. Mostly, no one reads them. The last image lingers because it refuses a tidy end. One evening, I stood on the cliff where the fog gathers like a waiting thing and let the wind take the edges of my sentences. I thought of telling the town everything I had collected, of parading proof in front of a world that prefers its own version of smallness. Instead, I folded a photograph and a key into a paper boat and set them on the tide. I watched until the fog swallowed my offering. Maybe someone else will find it, and maybe they will believe. Or maybe the fog has learned to read.